Hi everyone, welcome to this week's module where we are going to be talking about Chapter 10, which will encompass practical issues in conducting interviews, focus groups, and participant observation. So, first off, what kind of observation are we going to be conducting and what kind of research? So, we're going to look at ethnographic and participant observation with a bigger emphasis on participant observation. So, ethnographic research has more social anthropological feel. It may focus more on the business and the organizational setting, broken down by the departments and the functions within that department. It may focus on the different national sites of an operation as well, and its focus will be on community described and its symbols, cultures, interactions, rituals, language, etc. So, in this kind of research, you're going to different locations, typically on a national level, trying to encompass and get a feel and understand what's going on within different communities. And that the word community can be a lot of different things to a lot of different peoples. It could be symbols, it could be the culture, how they interact with each other, what language they speak or languages if it's multi-language. Then we have participant observation. So participant observation allows the researcher a direct experience of a specific situation or event. An example could be working in a factory and office setting during a transitional period of perhaps a manager, a floor manager, or just the boss overall. So you're putting yourself in that situation to observe your participants to see how they handle the transition from one manager to another, trying to understand and get a feel for how they're reacting to it. So both ethnographic research and participant observation have intense involvement of the researcher in the field. It's an effort. The reason there's such an intense involvement is because we need to put in an effort to feel like we're an insider, and I'm using quotes if you could see me, to try and explain what this feels like. We're trying to make ourselves as engrossed in this group or culture as much as possible so that we can get a better understanding of what they're thinking and feeling. It's usually difficult to do in a short time frame, and the researcher needs to be able to commit a long period of time for these types of studies. Typically, it won't be problematic in the real world to have something like this occur because your boss can just order employees to participate in this group. The boss could say, hey, you're going to go down. We're getting rid of the CFO. We have a new CFO's coming in. You're going to go to the accounting department and witness them and research and observe and see how they handle this new transition. Do they come with any problems? Do they identify any problems? Anything like that. Oftentimes in that scenario, you're going to have a harder time adapting and integrating into that work culture because essentially you'll be viewed as an outsider that the boss put there to watch them, which is never really good. When the researcher is not part of a company or organization where the researcher has the role or has no role, there is the need for negotiations to allow for this kind of long-term access. So you can't just show up at Nike headquarters and go into a department and start watching people and studying and things like that. You need to get permission. And oftentimes that could be negotiations with maybe the CEO or the president or the manager saying, all right, yeah, you could come in. You're allowed to come in from this time to this time. You're allowed to observe. You can do these things, but you can't do these things. So how would you gain access to an organization for this type of study? Well, you could just do cold calling up places to say, hey, here's what I have. Here's my theory. Can I put it into practice? Shooting off emails, maybe connections that you have. And how do you convince them of your credibility and trustworthiness? Again, I personally think it's showing that you have evidence to suggest that your theory is correct or your hypothesis is correct. So now we're going to talk about covert and overt research, and I'm going to play this video for you.
Would you give someone a deadly electric shock? Would you follow orders just to commit a violent crime against an innocent person if someone told you to? Or what about would you support an unjust cause just because someone told you to? People rarely see themselves as violent or capable of committing violent acts. They rarely see themselves on the wrong side of history, and yet human history is full of violence, genocides, and atrocities. In fact, in today's world, you might even see friends and family now, people that you believe are good people, supporting violence. But how does this happen? Well, I'm going to tell you about an experiment in psychology that set out to explain why people commit violence against others. And then I'm going to ask you these questions again. The true answers to these questions might surprise you. So, this study is called the Milgram Shock Study, also known as the Milgram Experiment. Its name comes from Stanley Milgram, the psychologist behind the study. So Milgram was born in the 1930s in New York City to Jewish immigrant parents. As he grew up, he witnessed the atrocities of the Holocaust from thousands of miles away. How could people commit such atrocities? How could people see the horror in front of them and continue to participate in it? These questions followed him as he became a psychologist at Yale University. And in 1961, he decided to set up a study that might show how people follow orders from authority, even if it goes against their morals. So, how did the study work? Well, over the course of 2 years, Milgram recruited men to participate in a study. He created a few variations of the study, but in general, they involved a participant, a learner, and an experimenter. The participant acted as a teacher, reading out words to the learner. The learner would then have to repeat the words back to the participant, and if the learner got the words wrong, the teacher had to deliver an electric shock. Now, these shocks increased in voltage. At first, the shocks were around 15 volts, just a mild sensation. But the shocks reached all the way up to 450 volts, which is actually extremely dangerous. Now, you must know, these shocks were not real. The learner was an actor who played along with the study, so people were not harmed in this study. The experimenter encouraged the participants to administer these shocks whenever the learner was incorrect. As the voltage increased, some participants resisted. In some variations of the study, the experimenter would urge the participants to administer the shocks. This happened in stages. Some participants were told to please continue, and eventually they had no choice but to continue. In some variations of the study, the actor would beg the participant not to administer the shocks, complaining of a heart problem. In some cases, the actor actually would even fake death once the highest voltages were reached. So you might be surprised to hear that this study even took place. There are obviously some ethical concerns behind asking participants to deliver dangerous electrical and even deadly shocks. The trauma of that study could impact the participants, some of whom did actually not learn the truth of the study for months after it was over. Maybe they thought they killed someone. But you might also be surprised to hear that a lot of participants did actually administer the most dangerous shocks. After the experiment was over, Milgram asked a group of his students how many participants they thought would deliver the highest shock. And the students predicted 3%. But in the most well-known variation of the study, a shocking 65% of participants reached the highest level of the shocks. And every single participant reached 300-volt levels. So the Milgram shock study took place over 50 years ago, and it's still considered one of the most controversial and infamous studies in modern history. The study even inspired TV movies. But not everyone praises Milgram for his boldness. The results of the study aren't particularly optimistic, and there have been critiques from psychologists over the years. After all, Milgram's selection of participants wasn't perfect. All of the participants were male, a group that only represents 50% of the population. Would the results be different if women were asked to deliver the electric shocks? Another factor to consider is that, like in the Stanford prison experiment, all of the participants answered a newspaper ad to participate in the study for money. Would the results have been different if the participants were not the type to volunteer for an unknown study? Other critics believe that documentation of Milgram's experiment suggests that some participants were coerced into completing the study. Psychologist Gina Perry believes that participants were even bullied into completing the study. Perry also believes that Milgram failed to tell the participants about the truth of this study. Rather than telling participants that a learner was an actor and shocks were never delivered, experimenters simply allowed participants to calm down after the study and then send them home. She believes many were never told the truth, and in that case, it's not very ethical, especially when their participation could have meant injuring another person. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about replications. Because with most of these studies happening 50 years ago, psychologists have attempted to retest Milgram's theories, and it's been hard to replicate the study because of the controversial methods. But similar studies have slightly tweaked Milgram's methods and have yielded similar results. Other replications takes Milgram's findings a step further. People are more obedient than they might seem. Now, does this mean that we're all bad people, just hiding under a mirage of sound judgment? Not really. 5 years after the publication of Milgram's experiment, a psychologist, Walter Mischel, published Personality and Assessment. It suggested that trait theorists were looking at personality theory all wrong. He suggested that different situations could drive different behaviors. Thus, something called situationism was born. Studies like Milgram's experiment and the Stanford Prison experiment are still considered supporting evidence of situationism. So let me ask you the questions at the beginning of the video. Would you give someone a deadly electric shock? Would you follow orders to commit a violent crime against an innocent person? Would you support an unjust cause just because someone told you to? Or would it just depend on the situation? I hope you really enjoy this video on the Milgram shock study, and I definitely hope you learned something. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment below or check out some of the other videos in my social psychology series. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.
So, there's a lot of stuff that we just talked about in that video, and it really brings up this idea of covert and overt research, informing the participants of what's going on. So covert research is a study where the participants are deliberately misinformed about what the study is about or why they're in the study at all. So it's covert, like a covert spy. No one's being told what's going on. Overt research is the exact opposite, where the participants are well informed and know what the research is about and what the intended purpose of the research is. So the reason I showed this Milgram study, and this video didn't go a lot into it, is that there was a lot of long-term psychological effects, negative ones, that came along with the participants that were not informed until much longer after, or even shortly after, because they were tricked. They believed that they had killed somebody in certain situations, and it really did leave a huge impact. So it plays into this ethical idea. Is it ethical or not? Should we do covert or overt research? So if covert research is undertaken without authority, problems of access and reactivity disappear. So other problems form as a result. So in this covert research, you're going to get more real world results, as I would say, because no one's going to know that you're from the boss or you're from the higher ups doing research. So people are probably going to act more natural, more honest, and more realistic. But other problems do come up. So there's difficulty of taking practical research notes when you are not meant to be working on that job. So if you're the new guy and you're just walking around, you ask someone a question, you start taking notes on a notepad, it's going to seem a little bit weird. So, there's that challenge, and you're unable to use other research methods during this period, such as interviews, because, it's going to be very obvious and apparent, and at that point your covert research is no longer viable because people know you're there doing research, or they're suspicious and their answers might be different because of that. Anxiety exists for the researcher in this scenario about their role and activities, and if the researcher is discovered, the entire study will have to be abandoned before completion. So you need to maintain your cover the entire time, just like a spy. You need to be undercover, because if the status of your cover changes, well then your research going forward will be different, therefore it's not consistent, therefore it's unreliable. Like I mentioned, there's problems of ethics. Is it ethical to lie to people for certain situations or for research? Some scenarios it is, and some scenarios it's not as much. And is there a possibility for a happy medium between covert and overt research? And when would you try covert participant observation research? That's something that I'd ask you guys to think about. Regardless of your covert and overt research, the researcher will need to develop skills of relationship building to allay colleagues' suspicions about being a representative or a spy from top management. You need to make your participants, or those that you're observing, comfortable knowing that you're not there to try and snitch on them, and You're not there to try and get anybody in trouble. You're just trying to understand the situation, and developing a relationship is the best way to do that. It helps to maintain a degree of objectivity in the organization. And to develop key informants is important. You want to be able to find those people you can rely on that could become your key informants, who could be used to provide broad organizational background and check out stories you're told. So if someone tells you something, you need to find someone that can essentially look into that for you. Kind of a person on the inside. So now we're going to talk about structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews. We talked a little bit about this last week. You have a lot of good comments in the discussion posts, which is awesome. So I say, let's talk a little bit more in depth. So like I said, there's structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Unstructured interviews have little to no questions developed for the interviews. It's similar to a normal conversation. It still targets your research topic, but it's a formless interview style. You're not constrained to just following a list of questions, whether that be semi-structured or structured. It can help you to establish rapport and comfort with your participants is going to be useful for talking about sensitive topics. So if this style is utilized, you may need to do multiple rounds of interviews. Why? Well, because you might not be able to actually touch upon all of the different areas you intend to. And that's because you're not following any similar structure or set structure. You are trying to have a conversation, as I could best describe it. Semi-structured interviews is an interview style where the researcher and the participant engage in a formal interview format. The interviewer develops and uses an interview guide, as we'll call it, which is a list of questions and topics that need to be covered during the conversation, usually in a particular order. So I'm developing questions, and I'm going to go through those questions. The interview follows the guide, but the interviewer is allowed to follow up on items brought up in conversation and may stray from the guide when the interviewer feels that it is appropriate. So if I say I really like working from home and flexible working arrangements, the interviewer can ask me, well, why do you like flexible working arrangements? Or maybe they could say, does your family have an impact on your flexible working arrangements, or why you like them? It's a little bit more free-flowing, but still sticking to that general structure. It provides a clear set of instructions for the interviews and can provide reliable, comparable qualitative data. And the ability to follow up gives opportunity for identifying new ways of seeing and understanding the topic. So it is a positive. So when to use semi-structured interviews, I'm going to leave that up to you guys to decide. For me, I think it's when you want to dive into deep data, but still want some form of structure to keep consistency. So, structured interviews, these are the most rigid type of interview. They strictly adhere to the interview guidelines and questions or questionnaire that's pre-developed. You are going to develop a questionnaire, and then you're going to stick to that. There's no straying from it. It keeps very consistent results. No opportunities exist to probe for follow-up information, and the method can be advantageous when the researcher has a comprehensive set of questions. So if you develop a very thorough set of questions, this style of interview could be very beneficial to you, because you could get in, you could get out, and you could be done with the interview in a consistent and expedited amount of time, which will help you actually reach more participants. Need to consider the issue of time. So the amount of time spent on a single interview will vary from research to research. If no time allotment is booked, interviewer will have a difficult time stopping the conversation. Oh my goodness, excuse me. I apologize. So if no time allotment is booked for an interview, the interviewer will have a difficult time stopping the conversation. So What I'm saying by that is at the start of the interview, say, thank you for coming. I really appreciate your time. Let's get the most out of the next 30 minutes. And I'll remind us when we're at the last 5 minutes so that way we can wrap up any final thoughts. It helps keep things a little bit more formal. It doesn't seem as rude because you don't want to just, if you have to stick to a 30-minute window because you booked interviews back to back, you don't want to just cut somebody off in the middle of a sentence, so it really, and that helps build rapport as well. So it really does help to establish a time frame for how long you're going to be interviewing for. The time commitment should be realistic but not too long. So it's realistic for my research that I did to interview people for 30 minutes. I would book them for 45 minutes, but I would preface that typically it takes around 30 minutes. I'm realistic. I'm not making it too long. If you interview someone for an hour and a half, that is going to be a lot more difficult to actually get good data out of those people because, you'll get gassed out. Imagine talking to someone for an hour and a half. Essentially, at some point, you're going to run out of things to say. You're going to be repeating yourself. And it's just going to be not as good of a time. Always book extra time in the case an interview goes too long. Like I said, I would book people for 15 minutes extra. So let's talk about the interview guide. So the researcher needs to prepare key questions in advance of the interview. Helps to achieve your research outcomes and can be consistent and professional in your approach. You don't rely too much on predetermined questions. Being able to stray slightly will help find meaningful data. So being able to follow up on anything that's said or mentioned, such as in a semi-structured interview, is going to help you find deep, rich data. There is a tendency for a researcher to anticipate questions for later in the interview. So don't cut someone's response off just because you know they'll say the same thing later. Let them play it out. It could alter their thoughts and may not be brought up later on. So if someone's speaking, don't cut them off. Just let them continue. And don't worry about interviewees answering questions ahead of time, just like I said. You don't want to cut them off. You don't want to ruin their train of thought. You've probably been in a conversation with a friend and someone else walks on by to say hello. You go back to your conversation and you say, "What was I saying?" Well, you just lost that train of thought. So you don't want that to happen to your participant because you want that good data. So the interviewee and the interviewer are going to engage in an interview. Well, the interviewer has certain behaviors that they should try and adhere to or improve upon when doing the interview process. They also need certain qualities about them that help get through the interview process. So the interviewer should be knowledgeable about the topic. Structuring, so make sure you're structuring your interviews and the session in a way that makes sense. You need to be clear, gentle, sensitive, and open. All qualities that are going to help make your participant be more open and honest with you. You need to have the ability to steer your participant in the right direction. So if they're getting a little bit too off topic, you're going to want to be able to steer them back to the focus, back on task, essentially. And one of the other important ones is interpreting. You need to be able to interpret what they're saying in the moment, them being your research participant, as well as later on when you're coding and then analyzing that data. The interviewer competencies should be opening the interview, so you should be able to open up the interview effectively, lead into the questions using appropriate language, questioning and listening to your participant, testing and summarizing for understanding, recognizing and dealing with difficult participants. So if someone's getting a little bit too anxious or rowdy, bringing them back on task. You need to be able to record the responses, so having an effective tool that helps you record them is going to be important, as well as closing the interview. You can't just say, "All right, thanks, bye." You need to be able to establish rapport by saying, "Well, thank you very much. That last comment you made is super amazing. I really appreciate your time. Are there any final thoughts? At that point, they'll say whatever they want to, and then you say, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day. And then you end the recording. And that's going to make them feel good. They're going to feel appreciated that they were there for you and that you were there for them. So after the interview, you need to immediately take notes about what happened. So yes, you researched prior to the interview, and then you recorded during the interview. So at that point, you're prepared. You have the information. But writing down notes is going to be super important related to maybe their body language. So that way it'll help you interpret your data later on. If there were any interruptions at any point, write down how it went, where it happened, any specific comments that were made that you think are so important that you should definitely focus on later on. Write down just any thoughts that you have, because that's going to help you interview later on. So there are some practical issues related to focus groups. So a focus group is an interview style which consists of multiple people being interviewed in a group setting. So you've probably heard of focus groups before. If you ever watched the show Impractical Jokers, you'll oftentimes see focus groups on that show, where one of them presents a ridiculous idea to a group of 5 people, and they're trying to get 5 people's feedback, get their comments and opinions. When you're doing this type of focus group, one big challenge is the recording of the focus group. So a large group setting can make it difficult to hear everyone and understand who's speaking in an interview recording through the equipment. The preferred method for this is to use a video recorder rather than just a tape recorder or on your phone, because you can see who's speaking at any given moment. You could say, all right, Charlie over there said this, and then Susan in the back left said this. And it's going to offer a lot more contextual information on the participants that's going to help you later on. Focus groups are not easy to run. They can be creative places, but they can strike challenge and conflict because of the group dynamic. You know, things come up, whether that be, say, politics, opinions, feelings on any given matter, and oftentimes it could be a little challenging to rein those strong feelings in. You're going to need a light touch of management to ensure that you have good civil communication and respect between participants. You at no point want your group to start saying very offensive or very off color or very just rude and mean things to each other, because that's going to hurt the overall experience, and it's going to hurt the data that you're collecting, as well as nobody's going to want to come back for another interview. You don't want to stop the conflict totally, as it could spark creative ideas and discussion on the topics within the group. It's just more so that management, trying to rein people in so that way nobody's being rude and nobody feels like they're being offended. You're going to need enough sessions to allow the researcher to anticipate what the responses will be. So participants need to be chosen with purpose. These groups need to be homogeneous grouping. They need to have something in common. There needs to be something that creates these participants to essentially fall into different categories, whether that be maybe they're all Democrats, maybe they're all Republicans, maybe they're all male participants between the age of 25 and 35. You need to consider the size of groups. I apologize about that typo there. So you need to consider the size of groups. You will need to consider how big the room is that's available to you. So if you have 20 participants, but it's a room that's big enough to fit 10 people, well, then that's not going to work out very well. It's going to be very cramped. People are probably not going to stick through the entire thing because they're going to say, all right, I'm over being stuck, pressed up against a bunch of other people. And attendance is a factor to consider. There's the role of the group facilitator, which would be you. Too much control will make it difficult for a free-flowing discussion. So like I mentioned before, you want to allow some discourse and conflict to occur. But if you have too little control or a lack of discipline, you're probably going to ignore a lot of key issues, and you're probably going to get off topic very easily. So with that, that's the end of the lecture. Let's just briefly talk about the project deliverable for this week, which is your literature review and APA outline. So I'm going to preface this by saying you're submitting a literature review. This APA outline is a separate component, which I'm going to discuss, and you can look more online at the directions and email me at any time if you feel confused. So for this assignment, you're going to create a document using APA formatting. That's going to consist of headers, title page, and etc. Please look up what those different APA components are if you ever need to review them. APA is super important in any field that we're in because this is what most people use. You've probably heard of MLA before. Oftentimes in these science-based fields, such as business science, we use APA formatting. So first, you're going to create an outline using these correctly formatted headers for your paper, and then you're going to write your literature review. Now, obviously, I'm going to dive a little bit more into that. This is a little simplistic. For your outline, so this is what your paper is going to look like. You're going to use level 1 headers, which I have examples on the next slide about the different kinds of headers. You're going to create an introduction section, a literature review section, a methodology section, a findings section, and a conclusion, as well as afterwards you're going to have your reference or works cited page. You're going to ensure you're using level 1 and level 2 headings in your literature review. So you're going to have level 1, you're going to have level 2. You may need level 3, but that's going to be up for you to decide. So in APA formatting, you can see these different levels of headings. So level 1 is going to be centered, bold, title case. Level 2, left align, bold, title case. Level 3 headings are left align, bold, italic, title case. And you could look up exactly when you think you should be using them. Essentially, it's a way of just organizing and keeping information together for the purposes of the reader. Whoever's reading our paper, that's who's going to benefit from this outline. So you're going to create your parenthetical citations, more commonly known as in-text citations. These link your content to the appropriate source in the reference list and ensures that you are correctly attributing your ideas to the original author. So, you went through and you summarized the different articles 2 weeks ago. You did a great job. You didn't cite them because I didn't ask you to because you were just summarizing. Now that you're going to talk about and reference certain ideas, possibly using quotes, you need to put in-text citations to attribute that information to whichever article you're referring to. First, you're going to organize your notes into themes. So you should have an unfiltered list of about 20 to 30 bullet points at this point based on last week's assignment, linked to your references by citations. So read through your notes, pull together those notes that share a common theme. Then you're going to start grouping these themes together, these bullet points. So the way I do it, as I read an article, I will create bullet points, which you've done. Once I have bullet points, I will open a whole new document and I'll start grouping those bullet points together based on whatever I'm seeing in that article. I'm going to give it a heading. So that way I could see, all right, this group is talking about flexible working arrangements and how they affect family life. And then in the next group of maybe 8 bullet points, it's talking about how flexible working arrangements offer more flexibility for those who want to work more but have other commitments such as family commitments. Once you have all of those notes grouped into different sections, those will be your themes, you're then going to translate those notes into paragraphs. So essentially you're going to take those bullet points and now start putting them together, writing paragraphs, give it an introduction sentence, and so forth. So like I said, start by opening your notes and then open up a separate document. Copy and paste those notes from one document to the other, grouping them into different sections. bonus tip, if you have a lot of different notes that can make up 3 to 4 paragraphs, meaning that all it's going to be all very closely related to each other, you could label them with a theme and name that theme using a level 2 header. Like I said, once you organize those notes, start writing your paragraphs. Delete any notes that you think don't fit or flow with what you're saying. Everything needs to make sense. You're not going to want to just throw information in there just to make your paper that much longer, because you don't want unnecessary information, because that will just confuse readers and will make your research seem as though it's not as professional as it could be. In the end, you're going to have a 2 to 3 page literature review that you will then submit for this week's assignment. Ensure that you're also including a reference page at the end of the paper, and please look up proper APA formatting for your reference page. So one final thing is that this week there is going to be an emphasis on grammar as well as formatting. So if your grammar is off, you will then lose points. If your formatting is off, you're going to lose points. That's because we're now putting our paper together. So please, please, please write your paper, save it, close it, come back to it the next day, and read what you wrote. Please read what you wrote, because you'll probably find some spelling mistakes or some sentences that don't make a lot of sense, because I will have to be harsh on this, only because we need to improve our writing skills at this stage of the game. When it's just a summary or some bullet points, it's not as prudent to have totally correct thoughts and statements. But now that we're at the literature stage, now it's important. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Shoot me a message through Canvas, however you prefer. Thank you. Bye.